A CTO is not a hero. At least they shouldn't be. Granted, in a very small team, a lot of times the hero has to jump in and solve the big problems. But a CTO really should be a strategic position, coaching and managing a team. We're going to talk about that today on Product Driven, along with all the fundamentals of what it really takes to be a CTO. It's really the basics of managing people in communications, not being the hero. To survive and thrive, you must adopt a product-driven mindset. And we're back for another episode of Product Driven. Today, I'm with Adam Horner, who is a coach of many CTOs, has worked with hundreds of CTOs all around the world. And we're talking about some of the common problems that CTOs have. And of course, at Product Driven, we're always thinking about how product plays into the role. And I think Adam's gonna agree with me here that product is also a challenge for a lot of CTOs. A lot of the trend now, especially in smaller companies, is a CTPO role. I want to talk about that today. Adam, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's really good to have a chat with you today, Matt.
How is it working with CTOs all over the world? Are we a weird crowd to coach?
I mean, I think in terms of coaching, there's a great crowd to coach because I think most CTOs come from a technical background. Most absolutely love learning. That's a lot of the reason why they got into working with software in the first place, because there's a long, continuous learning curve. And so most CTOs love that concept of self-improvement and getting better. And then when it comes to the various domains to learn, there's the business side, there's the finance side, and then there's all the other aspects of running the business and being strategic. There's just a lot to pick up. And so I find that a lot of CTOs are very welcoming and engaging in the coaching. And so therefore it's gratifying as a coach to be able to see people level up so quickly and so effectively.
Well, like any C-level job, there's like so many aspects to it. But at the end of the day, it always comes down to people, right? Like I manage a company with hundreds of people, and at the end of the day, it all ends up being about the people. But if you're a CTO at a very small company, you may not have a lot of people, right? It's a totally different role. And hence when people come to you, they're all over that spectrum, right? Like they're trying to figure out how to get a product built, how to get a product to market, versus if they're a CTO at a large company, they may be focused entirely on like people and process management and not really in the technical aspects of it at all, right?
That's it. And a lot of it comes down to how strategic can you be at the scale that you're at.
Yeah.
When you've got 3, 4, 5 people around a table, there's no need to be strategic. You can talk to everybody in front of you with literally seconds notice. And so it's very dynamic. But therefore, things like emotion management, focus, challenging on the product aspects rather than getting distracted with all those wonderful tech bits that you could do is the challenge. Whereas, as you say, in the larger companies, it's making sure you're looking further ahead, looking after people's well-being, making sure people have a career path, as well as the right people are working on the right things. And so, yeah, the role is very different based on the scale and size of the company. And I like Daniel Jajura's method of sort of breaking into 4 segments through time.
So what are those 4 segments?
Well, you start off with the startup CTO, which I tend to prefer to call the founding engineer because they're not really a CTO at that point. There's basically one person building the technology. Perhaps they've got a few people working with them, but they're basically building the MVP or the very first version of it. From there, you go up to the expert CTO, and this is the person who's now built a reasonable amount of subject matter expertise. They are almost certainly the expert on the technology stack that has been built so far. If they've got a team, it's probably very small. And somewhere around about there's a transition up to the managing CTO, which is the third stage. And the managing CTO probably has a team, maybe even 2 teams by that stage. They're probably closing in on product market fit. And at that stage, there's this sort of very fuzzy area of where the focus needs to be next to get up to the next level. Because the final stage, the executive CTO, is very much the strategic version of the CTO. And at that level, clearly strategy is the number one thing they're looking at. But there's all the other aspects of working in a business and leading the business that come with the territory. And those first 2 and the second 2, there's this sort of gap between them, which I call the CTO chasm. And it's basically this cloud of stuff you need to learn and get to grips with and start using and working with that you probably haven't in your career up to date as a CTO.
Well, you mentioned earlier when it's a small team of 3 to 5 developers, you don't spend as much time being strategic. But isn't that also one of the biggest problems? And this is a problem with all roles, right? Like we have to stop and step back and work on the business, not work in the role, right? Like we have to step back and question ourselves of like, well, what are we doing? Why are we doing it this way? not
Yeah.
just heads down in the code or heads down on the problem.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that people tend to lose at that stage when they're just heads down in the problem is, well, what happens if we succeed? Because you're always wondering about whether you're going to run out of money or whether the product's going to crash, or whether the customer's actually going to buy the thing. But then at the same time, well, what happens if we do succeed? What happens if we do need to scale to thousands, tens of thousands, millions of users? What happens if our infrastructure is not going to stand up to it? What if the technology choices we've made end up causing us problems down the line because maybe we can't hire people with those skills? So yes, there is a point that at that level you do need to be strategic and look further ahead. But at the same time, a lot of CTOs at that level are kind of thinking, well, what happens, at the end of this funding round, at the end of this sprint, the end of this month? And that kind of focuses the gaze very determinedly short term.
Well, as somebody who has spent my entire career doing this job as basically the founding engineer, is a great way to put it. Like, I was the founding engineer at 23 years old. I was not the executive CTO then, right? And over a long period of time, you morph through the four different roles you mentioned. I feel all along the spectrum, the really difficult thing is to be both context switching from trying to be the manager to being the individual contributor. And I don't know about you and your background and the things that you've done, but for me, when I'm working on a problem, my brain doesn't stop working on that problem, right? Like, I show up into a meeting and I'm still thinking about whatever the problem was I was trying to solve before the meeting. I'm like a dog on a bone. Like, my brain is not going to stop being obsessed with whatever the problem is, which is what makes us great engineers, right? Makes us terrible managers.
Yeah, because context switching has a very, very high cost when you have that sort of level of hyper focus.
Is this a common problem you see with the CTO coaching?
Absolutely. And what I find is that, so the way I characterize it is people end up in what I call firefighting mode, because they focus on things so much that the only way something comes in and interrupts it is when there's literally a fire burning. Oh my God, I've got to deal with it. So people have this habit of jumping from fire to fire. They hyper focus on each one and don't realize the little tiny embers starting up somewhere else until it's a full-blown raging furnace. They've got to go and tackle that one next. And so as a company grows up, you get more people. Somebody who stays with that kind of hyper-focus approach, that very individual contributor approach to things, doesn't necessarily end up being strategic and higher level in terms of the way that they manage and operate until they can start taking control of their calendar, delegating things down to other people, and delegating decision-making. That's probably one of the hardest things I see most first-time CTOs is delegating a decision and the consequences that go with it.
Well, you bring up a couple really good points there, and I think from the analogy of being like the dog on the bone, I feel like was always my problem. I'd even show up to meetings, I wouldn't be engaged, and everything, there's like a whirlwind of things going on around you that you're just not paying attention to. And to your point, it makes it very difficult to delegate and drive ownership. And so as part of Product Driven, I'm working on creating a course and writing a book. And there's actually a whole huge section of it is about ownership. And I feel like that is one of the biggest challenges in all engineering teams. And especially for them to scale, you have to scale that ownership. Because if you have the CTO or product team that's driving every single decision, be it from the product and from the technical aspect, the team will never scale. If you get to 100 people, but all of them are just order takers, the team is never going to scale. Everybody's sitting around waiting to be told what to do. You have to create pockets of ownership at every level, even if it's you own this part of the code, you own this feature of the product, you own this one product of 100 products that we have, right? How does that manifest in the coaching that you do?
So one of the things that I try and get my CTOs to do is instead of saying you should do this, you need to do that, or we should be doing X, is try and instead asking the question, what should we be happening next? What should we be doing next? And then try and get to the point where they don't see anything and let each person come to them and say, I intend to, whatever it is that they've decided that they think is the next thing. So then the CTO, the leader, can then say, well, great, go and do it. Or, oh, have you thought about this? Have you considered the impact on the other? And this idea of going from, okay, you need to do this, you need to do that, like speaking first to speaking last, and waiting for the I intend to is actually really well articulated in a great book about US Navy submarine captain who took over the command of probably the lowest performing submarine in the Pacific Fleet. His name is David L. Marquette, and the book that he wrote is called Turn the Ship Around, which is quite a good metaphor anyway for leadership, going from this point of leading from the front and pushing versus leading from the back and supporting. as everybody else, decides themselves what they're going to do and then learns from their own consequences and actions. And so I recommend that book very highly for exactly this kind of change of mindset from pushing, doing, leading from the front to leading from the back, delegating the accountability as well as the responsibility.
Yeah, I saw some on LinkedIn the other day that was along the same topic. It was talking about the person who invented the term alpha dog was not understood correctly. Like the alpha dog wasn't the lead dog. It was the dog in the back of the pack that was watching all the other dogs, making sure everybody else was okay, right? It was the same exact thought process, right? And I've always manifested that as like the inverse pyramid. I always tell everybody, it's like, you don't work
Leadership
for me,
is
I
like
work
an inverse
for
pyramid,
you.
isn't it? Yeah. I call it the Atlas principle, right? So rather than being at the top on top of and being in charge of all these people, you're Atlas holding up the world and you're supporting everybody else.
But I think the biggest challenge, one of the challenges in engineering is engineering leaders. We end up being like heroes, and that ends up being part of our archetype, right? Is like, oh, there's this big fire, we run in and we go solve the problem, which makes it impossible to do what we're talking about, right? If we're the ones always running in, solving the big problems and being the hero, we're not supporting everybody else to go solve those problems.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where the idea of a firefighting team is a great one, because the image that most of us have of a firefighter is a hero who runs in at the front with a great big hose and starts spraying the water. But what you don't realize is that that person is supported by a pyramid of people behind them, supporting them as they go in with all the facilities and tools that they need. They never go in alone, they always go in as a team. And so I think that whole imagery is sort of perfect. And I love that also the visual that you often see, as you said, of the wolf pack running across the tundra with the alpha. He's the one at the back, making sure nobody gets left behind.
Yeah,
it's a very good metaphor for making sure that everybody's supported in the way that they go.
So how do you, when you're doing coaching, is this a common problem that you run into with people, that you have to help them rethink how they think about managing the teams and doing
exactly
the work?
that? So I think the first thing is, how do I manage myself? That's the first stage. Because a lot of the time people feel as though they're under pressure from their diary, from expectations of the rest of the team, from promises that are being made and struggling to meet. And so the first thing is, how can they take control of themselves, get their diary into a place where they can create space in it to do some thinking ahead and planning. And then once they've got to that, then they can begin to start doing it for the rest of the team and looking at how they actually build a strategy. And for me, a strategy is simply a case of, what's the situation right now? What's the state that we want to be in? And what are the changes we're going to make to get there? Those simple things often lacking from those CTOs who are sort of panicking and rushing from fire to fire. And so that basic form of planning is the basis of forming that long-term thinking, the future thinking, that allows you to start looking at things like, well, what are our customers going to need? Where is our marketplace going? What are our competitors working on next? And those kinds of questions become a lot easier to do so when you're yourself have space in your diary and your time to be able to think those broader questions, rather than just laser focused on put out that fire.
But when people come to you, do they already know they need to do this? They just struggle with actually doing it? Or do they not even know they need to do this?
Often they don't know that they need to do it. They can articulate the challenge and the problem. And the problem is normally, I don't have enough time. I'm racing from problem to problem. The expectations on me are high. I'm letting people down. That's the feeling that they have. And the actions that they're currently taking is that they are focusing very short term. And so the first step on that is to actually realize, well, that's where the challenge is that you're looking to the closest problems. And then the next thing from there, after they've got to that stage of sorting out their time and the way that they use it, sorting out their people and the way that they're leveraging their people, supporting them. And then you get to this point of, okay, so where do I go next? And the next thing then normally is to look at, well, what problem are we solving? Anticipating what the board, the executive team, the wider business is going to need. And then looking at how we can resolve some of those challenges and build bridges to the rest of the executive team, because that's at the point when you're beginning to become a leader and a peer to that top level team, rather than just being, reporting based on what the engineering folks are doing.
So you bring something else up that I really wanted to talk about today, that's along the same issue, but manifest a manifest issue in a different way. So as a CTO, when you show up to these board meetings, executive leadership meetings, I think one of the biggest problems is the CTOs don't have much to say, or they don't know what to talk about, or they want to talk about their tech stack and all this super highly technical stuff that the rest of the executive team just does not understand or does not care about. And the problem is the CTO is focused on the wrong issues, right? They're focused on the technical details, not the strategy of the product. Why are we building the product this way? Understanding the industry, understanding where the business is going to go. The higher level topics is this sort of C-level integration a big topic that you talk about in your coaching as well?
Absolutely, because I think it often starts from the feeling of not being a member of the team, but being somebody who reports into the team. And that shift, that takes time to actually do firsthand. And secondly, it requires a couple of those steps that you mentioned at the beginning when you're in those meetings and you're kind of switching off because your brain's still on that, how do I solve this problem? And that can happen, even when you sat in those executive meetings, the CEO or the finance director or the CFO is presenting the numbers and you're switched off because you're still thinking about how you can get that one piece of code to be performant enough. So that's the first thing, is to make sure you're actually engaged in those conversations and listen to the language of finance, the language of the domain, which we often call the business language, right? The language of the domain. And once you can begin to interpret between finance, the domain, and the technology, then you're at a level where you can communicate. Right? The first thing with communication starts with listening. So listen to the rest of the execs. Listen to what they're talking about. Listen to the concerns that they have, whether it's profit, whether it's margins, whether it's operating velocity, whatever it is. Understand what it is that the business is trying to achieve. Because if your technology team can support that, well, then you're supporting the business. If your technology team are going off in one direction, optimizing performance for the next 10,000 customers, and the business is actually thinking, well, how do we cut costs to make sure that we can survive this quarter? You've got two different directions. That's not going to end well, right? That's not one team. You've got two different purposes there. So aligning that sort of company goal and the technology goal into the same direction, that's the first part. That's the first stage. And that starts with listening, understanding, and then talking in those terms.
Well, and the challenge is your goal ultimately as a CTO is to translate to both sides, right? It's like, how do I understand the business part of it, the business needs, and go back to the rest of the engineering team and help, explain that to them and carry that message. But then also be able to surface the issues that come from the rest of the engineering team that need to make it back up to the board, right? Of like, oh, we need to re-engineer this thing. We have this big technical debt. We have this big looming problem, whatever the things are, right? So you have to sit in the middle of those. But one of the things I'm really focused on is all that has to be in service of product, right? And it depends on the type of company that you're working in. Obviously, if you're working at a railroad, product means something totally different than if you're at a SaaS company. But I feel like in all of these conversations, it's really product conversations, a high level, right? Like you should be sitting in these board meetings talking about the product direction. How are we going to improve the product? Do people like the product? They don't like the product? This is what sales is hearing. This is what marketing needs to do. Okay, engineering, how do you go build this product that, meets these goals? Like you shouldn't be talking about tech stacks and all this technical stuff. You should be talking about the product side of it, which should be driving most of the strategy.
Absolutely. And I find that the executive team will talk about why, what's our purpose, what's our vision, what's our mission, why are we doing these things? A lot of engineering talks about what. And so that translation layer in between, which can be in terms of product, it can be in terms of execution, it can be in terms of operations, is basically the how. And so as one of the executive leader, whether it's chief product officer, chief technology officer, you're translating how to either side in terms of how are we going to perform how are we going to fulfill the why? How are we going to do the what? How does the what fulfill the why? Right? That's basically that sort of interpretation layer there, the translation layer, if you want. And I think that's something that comes with practice, but there are a couple of hacks to doing that quite well. So one of the good ones is to use metaphors. So when you're trying to explain something like technical debt, why do we have to do this thing before we can deliver the other thing? Well, it's a bit like if you tried to put a new tire on the car, but you had to replace the wheel first, right? So using metaphors is quite a quick hack to get people to understand the relationships between things and the implications of things, and that works both ways as well. So you can use the same concept to explain business issues to the tech folks, right? So you can then use a metaphor that says, okay, the reason they want to do that, it's a bit like them having to get the Kubernetes cluster up before they can run any pods on it, right? So there's kind of use the metaphors both ways. It's a quick hack. It's imperfect. They often don't stand up to scrutiny, but it's a quick way of getting concepts across to people.
I'm sitting here laughing in my head because this is something I've always been really good at in my career. is using metaphors for things. It's like one of my weird skills that I've never understood, but I've always been good at explaining complex things in a simple way. And a lot of times that is using metaphors. And I would famously, with the engineering team, I'm famous for this, like they would get so bent out of shape about what we call things and being overly literal and specific that I would always tell them, like, just call it pink fluffy slippers. Like, I don't even care. Like, you guys are so bent out of shape about the nuance of what we're calling something that I would just call things like bizarre random names because they would drive me crazy because the developers were so, like, just so literal about every freaking thing. Could never get them to think.
Yeah, I mean, they say that's one of the 4 hardest things in software engineering, don't they? Caching errors, naming things, and off by 1 errors. It's the whole lot.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about CTO and this sort of executive level function. I think it's important. I look at it like engineering is 3 different kinds of leadership. You have strategic, you have people and process management, and then you have a technical part of it. And I look at it like that's kind of the pyramid. But that pyramid for me lives within the product pyramid. So there's like a higher level pyramid that engineering is living within. And the engineering or the product pyramid is the delivery side. It's like execution and delivery, which is the engineering function of it. But that could be replaced by like using some third-party product or licensing something else, like could be replaced, right? Depending on the type of business. But it's the delivery of the product. The other 2 functions of product, I feel like trump everything to do with engineering, are more important than anything that engineering does. And the first one, of course, is product strategy. But the second one is product usage and marketing. Like if you can build the most amazing product in the world, but if it's the wrong strategy, then it's a waste of time. Or if you're not doing product marketing and you don't know how to drive usage and drive, being best known, like, building the best known product is more important than building the best product.
Yeah, the awareness of it's crucial, isn't it?
The awareness of the product. And I think these are relatively simple concepts. I think most engineers are just don't understand. But does this make sense to you from a leadership level? Like CTOs need to understand, like you live within this product kind of world, and it doesn't matter what you're building. If you don't have the right strategy and people don't know that you built it, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, that's one of the things I always talk to CTOs about is understanding thoroughly the go-to-market strategy. Because understanding what channels, how they're useful, how growth happens is pretty crucial. Because if you're very much a sales-led organization, you make very different decisions than if you're a product-led organization. So if you're recruiting people in and they all come from a product-led background and you've got a big sales team of going out and talking to customers and selling them through traditional channels, then your people aren't necessarily going to get the concept of why they need to have such good things in a demo and why the demo doesn't necessarily need to match the end usage of the platform. Vice versa, if you've got people coming the other way around, they're thinking, well, we can put things in a demo, and they're not realizing that actually it's the first usage that's going to generate those follow-on users and the viral usage. So yeah, the go-to-market I think is fairly crucial, because if you build your team wrong, if you build the culture of your team wrong based on your go-to-market, you're going to struggle just as much as if you've got a good go-to-market strategy, but just no way of actually driving it, or no features that support it.
Well, and I think it's important that as engineering leaders, we drive that down through the whole team of them understanding. Yeah. And the first section in my book and the course I'm doing is about empathy. And it's about having empathy for the user, but it starts with like understanding who the user is, how they use the product, all the stuff, right? So like you said, the first time they log in to use our software, what does that look like, right? Like that whole track is really important. And you highlighted something else that's really important, and that's understanding, is the product being sold like traditionally from a sales perspective, doing demos, showing off all the bells and whistles, and then later on somebody actually goes and buys the software and uses it, versus kind of product-led growth where their first time they log in is like their entire experience, right? And if you don't nail that first-time experience, it all falls apart. And these are all the things that are so critical for the engineering team to understand, because if they don't understand this, like, again, they're not going to have empathy for that as well. They're not going to understand like the nuances of that and how important it is. And I think the challenge we have with most engineering teams is they're just in the dark in all of these things.
And one of the ways I try and get that across, again, I've got a little hack for this. It's you get the users to try and think, the engineers to try and think about how the users feel
Yeah.
when they go in. And so I use this language a lot. How do the users feel when they start using this? How do the users feel when they encounter this for the first time? Because that ranges from anything from frustration to delight, with all the emotions in between. But if you can get the engineers to focus on that true feeling of what it is to use this thing for the first time, or use this thing for the 100th time, and what emotions does it bring through in people, then they look at support tickets in a different way. They look at the customer requirements in a different way. And that basically is the empathy that we're looking for.
Yeah. To me, that empathy is so important. And I don't know about you, but I've worked with a lot of engineers that their attitude is just like, well, tell them to read the manual. I wrote the documentation. Leave me alone. Right? Like,
it works on my machine.
Yeah. But it's just the wrong attitude. Like, they have to understand, like, the user is the reason they even have a job. Right?
And it's so shocking how few engineering organizations get that as a collective organism. You might have individuals within it that get it, but the actual organization as a whole understands that users pay your salary is surprisingly low in a lot of places.
Well, and I feel like as engineering leaders, that's why it's our job to beat that drum, right? It's like every week, every couple of weeks, we're constantly focused on how do we get the voice of the customer and the users, their feedback, those feedback loops, the stories, the success. We sold this thing because we did this. A customer canceled because we don't do that. Like, all this kind of story has to trickle down to the rest of the team. So the rest of the team understands the work that they do and having that empathy. And I always told all of our team, it's like, all of you work in sales, right? Like, if you build a great product, then more people will buy it. Or if you build a crappy product and it has lots of support issues, like, we're going to have a lot of people that cancel, right? It's like everybody that works in engineering sort of works in sales and support from that perspective.
And I think the key phrase you used there was beating the drum. You don't hit a drum once and expect people to have heard it. You have to hit it again and again and again. They say that people have to hear a phrase 8 times before they even register that it's been said, no matter what the content was on it. And so I think that comes true for a leader talking to the engineering team about trying to reinforce, whether it's the mission, the vision, whether it's the user perspective. You've got to say it a lot until you're bored of it. And then people are just beginning to pick up on it. And the same thing goes the other way around for talking to users about knowing that your product exists. You've got to keep telling them again and again until they get the idea, oh, that thing is there and I can use it. And that same is true with enterprise software as it is with consumer software. And that's one of those universal truths. Communication is not a one and done thing. And a lot of engineers kind of think of communication as that way because they like to think of themselves as smart. Somebody tells me something, I hear it, I take action on it straight away. That's how they think they work. And they don't really realize that actually I need to hear something a lot of times before that feedback sinks in. And now I've got it and now I can internalize it. So yes, I think beating the drum, I think, is a key phrase on that one for me.
Well, you highlight something else that's really important, that almost everything in life comes down to the fundamentals, right? And some of the things we've been talking about on this episode is a lot of fundamental stuff. And I'm sure when you do your CTO coaching, it's the same thing, right? It's like they're missing these key fundamentals and they may know that they need to do them, but it's like, oh, I did that in the past. Now maybe I don't see as much value in it because, I don't know, I just moved on to something else I think is even more important or more strategic to do. So I've stopped doing some of these other things that are fundamental. Would you say that's the same sort of issue you see in your coaching? Is like there's like these 10 fundamentals and it's like you always have to keep pushing people back to just focusing on those fundamentals?
Yeah, and crucially, it's never just one or two things. So yes, people think, oh, I do that. But then when you dig into it a bit further, you'll find out that sort of they're round robin. They'll do a little bit of that, 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 and they'll go back to cycle. And because they're doing all these things in sequence, they kind of forget that they're missing out one there, missing out one there, missing out one there. And often, as we know, software, leadership, none of it's simple, it's complex. And it's like a lock, a key in a lock. You've got to have all the tumblers lined up correctly for the lock to open. And it's often the same thing with leadership, with leveling up, with strategy. You've got to have all these things aligned. And so unless somebody's doing all of them at the same time, they won't realize that, now with a full set, now it works. And if they're missing one or two, it might work a bit, but the whole thing will just jam a bit. And then that's when they begin to realize, it's not making any difference if I do that one. So I can just drop these two because it's not making a difference. And it's not because those two aren't working. It's because the others aren't there to support it and do it at once. So yes, it does come back to the basics. But what makes it complex is that you need to have a lot of basics all together, all working at the same time.
And I think in our heads, we may, because some of them are such basic things, we overlook them, right? And
Or sometimes they're just ignorant of them, especially if we've come from an engineering background and we haven't, grown up with the salespeople who get drummed into them how to communicate people, how to repeat things, how to phrase things to customers. Whereas we come from engineering, it's like we email each other, we use Slack and so on. But our language doesn't have to be precise and exact. You come through sales, you come through marketing, you come through operations. Communication's really crucial. And so we get to sort of leadership levels in engineering, and we just missed out on a bunch of this experience that the others have had. And so that's part of it as well, is just making sure that you know what you don't know.
Well, I really appreciate having you on the show today. Again, this is Adam Horner, CTO coach. If you're a CTO or engineering leader and looking for somebody to give you some help and pointers and tips and learn all these fundamentals, Adam clearly is very brilliant at this and would be very helpful to you. Come more at sonova.tech. But Adam, why don't you tell us a little more about your business, your podcast, how to find you on LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. So I'm Adam Horner on LinkedIn, and I coach CTOs from those very early stages of becoming a tech leadership, senior tech leader. So not always from being a CTO, but VP engineering team leader, and so on. And then up through those grades of CTO, all the way through to the strategic CTO, where focusing on, running hundreds headcount engineering organizations. So that's the coaching side of it. I focus really on 3 pillars. So you mentioned them before, actually: strategy, people, and processes, with a sort of underlying bed of communication which supports the whole lot. And a lot of coaches focus just on coaching, whereas, as we just said, I think there's a lot of skills that get missed out through the technology sort of career ladder, if you like. So I focus on coaching, teaching, and mentoring, and I blend them all together. And that way I find that there's a sort of a more rounded approach, but also a more personalized approach to coaching, because every CTO comes at a slightly different angle in a different way. So that's the coaching. As you said, I also have a podcast, which is called the CTO Playbook. It's very much about the same things. Playbooks that help achieve certain goals, certain aims. And so I get some great guests on. I also do some episodes myself on the CTO Playbook. So that's available on all the podcast platforms. And I also run events here in Gothenburg as well. So I'm a member of CTO Craft, which is a now global organization for CTOs. And so I run meetups in Gothenburg in Sweden and Stockholm in Sweden as well.
Awesome. Well, I really enjoy following you on LinkedIn. You produce really high quality content. So I definitely recommend our listeners to go follow you on LinkedIn.
Thanks so much.
And thank you so much for being on the show. And I hope to be on your show one day. So hopefully so people see me over there.
Definitely. We'll schedule in the new year. It'd be great to have you there, Matt.
So great having you on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care. Before we wrap up today's episode, we have a special resource for you if you're looking to elevate your development team to have more of a product-driven mindset. I have a fantastic free ebook about turning your code-first team into a product-first team. Please go to fullscaleteam.com/product-first-teams to download this free ebook. There's also a link in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Product Driven, and we'll see you in the next episode.